The man who would become one of the most vicious Sith warlords in galactic history had humble origins. Born Alec in the village of Squinquar Gesimus on the Outer Rim world of Kelly almost 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. When his homeworld was ravaged by the Mandalorians, he fled to the Galactic Republic. Discovered to be Force-sensitive, Alec was accepted into the Jedi Order. He trained at the Dantooine Enclave, where he befriended the fellow student who would eventually become Revan. The pair completed their training and were knighted just in time for the Mandalorian invasion of the Republic in 3964 BBY. While the Jedi Council dragged its heels in dealing with this threat, sensing an unseen menace pulling the strings, Alec and Revan refused to sit back and watch, leading a splinter faction of fellow Jedi Knights against the Mandalorians. Revan and Alec ultimately led Republic forces to victory against the Mandalorians, but at the cost of their own souls, their experiences in the war leading them to despise weakness. Discovering that the Mandalorian Wars had been manipulated by a third party, they followed the trail, discovering the existence of the surviving Sith Empire on Dromund Kaas. Confronting the Sith Emperor Vitiate, they were instead dominated by his powers of mental manipulation. Under the Dark Lord's influence, their fall to the dark side was completed, and they were sent back to Republic space to locate the Star Forge, an ancient Rakatan war factory. When they found the station, they rebelled against Vitiate, founding their own Sith Empire with Darth Revan as the Dark Lord of the Sith and Darth Malak as his foremost apprentice. Launching their own invasion of the Republic, they rocked the galaxy to its core, with many elements of both the Republic military and the Jedi Order defecting to their side, eager to join with the heroes of the Mandalorian Wars. However, Malak chafed under Revan's authority, and ultimately betrayed his master, firing on his master's flagship and apparently killing him, clearing the way for his own ascendance. Unfortunately for him, Revan had actually survived, having been rescued by the Jedi Order and brainwashed into serving as their primary agent against Malak. The two ultimately confronted one another on board the Star Forge, and Revan was victorious. Jedi Grandmaster Yoda was born 896 years before the Battle of Yavin, little over a century after the Battle of Ruusan and the apparent extinction of the Sith. His species and origin were unknown, and even the circumstances under which he joined the Jedi Order were shrouded in mystery, though legend holds that he was trained by the Hysalarian master Nakata Del Gormo in the swamps of Dagobah. What is known was that he trained his first Padawan and attained the rank of Jedi Master at the age of 96 in 800 BBY. Eventually, he was granted the title of Grandmaster and was given a seat on the Jedi Council as a lifelong member. Yoda ultimately had the misfortune of presiding over the twilight of the Jedi. The Sith, long thought extinct, had gone into hiding, quietly infiltrating and undermining the Republic political system, their machinations coming to a head with the start of the Clone Wars. With the Jedi forced into a military role that they hadn't occupied in centuries, Yoda was forced to watch helplessly as the Order was gradually whittled away by wartime attrition before being almost completely destroyed by Sith treachery. Yoda attempted to strike back by attacking the Dark Lord of the Sith, revealed to be the Republic Chancellor Palpatine, waging a titanic lightsaber duel in the Senate Hall, but he was ultimately defeated and forced to flee. Going into hiding on the swamp world of Dagobah, Yoda trained Luke Skywalker in the Jedi ways before dying of old age. Yoda transcended the material plane as a Force spirit, while Skywalker went on to overthrow the Sith and reform the Jedi Order. My overly negative assessment of Yoda was rooted in feelings of betrayal for having spent so long buying into the propaganda that Yoda was the greatest lightsaber duelist ever, only for that notion to basically collapse as soon as I started to seriously examine it. Basically, every other character in the franchise has a fighting style that, when accounting for the flashy stage fencing moves, still makes sense when viewed in the context of classical swordsmanship, whereas Yoda's style is, to put it mildly, pure stage fencing. All flash, no substance, created by animators who only know what looks cool and have no understanding of actual fencing. Having realized that he wasn't all that he was cracked up to be, I was kinda pissed off, and I proceeded to drop bricks on him. And as a result, my analyses had an extreme negative bias. I have since mellowed out, and I have put effort into making this analysis more balanced. That being said, I still stand by all my criticisms of Yoda's combative abilities, as his shortcomings seem really obvious to me, but I will be making sure to give him credit where it's due. Regarding Yoda's appearances in TCW, I will make some references, but my overall analysis is drawn almost entirely from Legends continuity. And with all of that out of the way, let us proceed with Darth Malak versus Yoda. As a Jedi, Malak was noted for a high level of aptitude, his training as a Jedi Guardian allowing him to develop into a strong combative Force wielder, though he didn't truly come into his own until after his fall to the dark side of the Force. His study of the Sith arts rounded out his education, with both his combat and utility powers being pushed to the next level. Malak's personal presence within the Force was so significant that his movements could be sensed from across the galaxy, and his very thoughts sent ripples through the Force. All of his followers readily acknowledged him as the strongest Sith, and he stood second only to Darth Revan and quite possibly Emperor Vitiate himself. As Malak started out as a combat specialist, Force-based physical augmentation was his bread and butter. Enhanced speed, strength, and agility enabled his development as a lightsaber duelist. Jedi meditation techniques allowed him to manage physical pain, improving his endurance and notably allowing him to survive Demigol's experiments during his time as a Mandalorian POW. Both of these capabilities were further elevated by his use of Sith techniques, Dark Rage improving his physical performance, and Dark Healing allowing him to actively repair damage to his body. And as profound as these powers were, they paled in comparison to his development in other areas. Already a formidable telekinetic as a Jedi, capable of unleashing powerful pushes and waves, he perfected his fine control as a Sith Lord. He has throttled the life from targets with Force grip, lashed out at enemies from a distance with lightsaber throws, and even mastered the Force whirlwind, manipulating the air currents around the target to lift them off the ground and rapidly spin them around. Though not fatal in and of itself, it's easy to see how an enemy would be disabled by this. Additionally, Malak has proven that he can reliably penetrate the telekinetic defenses of other Force adepts, and though no mention is made of the strength of his own barriers, I believe it's reasonable to assume that he would only be vulnerable against adepts of equal or greater strength. As a telepath, Malak's capabilities were straightforward but significant. He used the dark side to enhance his application of the Jedi mind trick, actively dominating the minds of subjects rather than simply influencing them. Additionally, he also boasted an immunity to fear effects and mental interference, though obviously this resistance had its limits, as he was just as vulnerable to the influence of Emperor Vitiate as anyone else. Predictably for a Sith Lord, Malak was a master of Force lightning, using it quite effectively as a weapon in battle and as an instrument of torture off the battlefield. Additionally, Malak was a master of Force Stun, an advanced Jedi ability that was used to paralyze targets by overloading their nervous systems with Force energy, typically used to disable targets non-lethally, though Malak usually followed it up with a decidedly lethal killing blow. Additionally, Malak has used the Force to augment the sound of his screams, using them as a sonic weapon. As mentioned, Darth Malak was not a pure combative Force wielder and boasted quite a broad and well-rounded skill set. He was skilled in the use of Sith sorcery and is known to have extensively researched and experimented with the Force-based technology of the Starforge. Possibly his greatest accomplishment in this regard was his use of Jedi POWs to enhance his own powers, placing them in artificially induced comas and hooking them up to the Starforge, turning them into repositories of Force energy that he could then draw upon at will. While utterly horrifying, this achievement marked Malak as an academic and technological innovator. In conclusion, this combination of arcane knowledge and a utilitarian focus made Darth Malak into one of the most powerful and dangerous Sith Lords in history. Sophisticated yet vicious, he wielded his abilities with cunning and creativity, fluidly using his combative abilities in combination with one another to lash out at his enemies with speed, precision, and overwhelming strength. However, he was not perfect. His arsenal demonstrated his near-absolute focus on overpowering his opponent directly, but it also meant that if his strength failed him, he had nothing to fall back on. With centuries of training and study in the Jedi arts under his belt, Grandmaster Yoda was unquestionably the greatest light-side Force wielder of his era. His philosophical and academic understanding of the universal energy field unparalleled within the Jedi Order, and his natural aptitude considered second only to Anakin Skywalker. Possibly his greatest achievement as a Force wielder was transcending the material plane as a Force spirit upon his death. His applications of his power for utility have been flexible and nuanced, though I feel that his combative abilities leave something to be desired. Where masters like Obi-Wan Kenobi or Mace Windu can produce quite dramatic results with comparatively subtle manipulations, Yoda's powers were blunt and straightforward. However, while Yoda lacked precision or creativity on the small scale, he was optimized for grand-scale feats, and was generally at his best when working in concert with others on the battlefield. During the Battle of Coruscant, he used telekinesis to devastate CIS forces, destroying fighter groups by levitating battle droids into their flight path and pushing CIS armor and infantry back into their landing craft before forcing the vessels to collide with one another. In the realm of telepathy, he was a master of battle meditation, a power that allowed him to decide the course of battles by improving the focus and morale of allies while demoralizing the enemy. This emphasis on large-scale influence and teamwork even carried over to his use of physical augmentation, which was based around Force Valor, a power that allowed Yoda to enhance the capabilities of others as well as himself. But all of this isn't to say that Yoda couldn't be effective on the small scale. He has employed basic telekinetic strikes quite deftly, was noted for his skill at disarming adversaries, and has effectively integrated these powers into his lightsaber sequences. With telepathy, he has influenced the thoughts and memories of even strong-willed subjects. Addressing Yoda's personal application of physical augmentation, the nature of his fighting style made enhanced agility and reflexes a priority, allowing him to fight as a blindingly fast offensive dervish. Additionally, he was a master of Tutaminis, using this ability to deflect blaster bolts with his bare hand, and more impressively to manipulate and redirect Force lightning. When combating non-Force wielders, Yoda used his powers with fluidity, precision, and almost no restraint, The best example being when a Yinchori warrior attempted to gun him down and fellow Jedi Sun Bates stepped in to defend him. Yoda seized Bates in a telekinetic grip and lifted him clear while simultaneously deflecting the Yinchori's blaster shot with Tutaminis, yanking the Yinchori's weapon out of his hand and then slamming him against a wall hard enough to kill him. To those who think that Yoda only uses the Force for knowledge and defense, please note that he just iced a guy without batting an eyelash. However, when pitted against other Force wielders, Yoda's precise and skillful powers became slow and blunt. I believe that this is the result of the vastly greater concentration and effort required to override the powers of other adepts, and likely for this reason, Yoda displayed a clear reluctance to take an offensive stance against such opponents, only using his own powers to defend or retaliate. To be clear, Yoda only experiences this difficulty when tussling with adversaries of equal or near equal power, and when contending with significantly weaker Force wielders, he is capable of plowing through their defenses with only a minimum of effort. Where the problems arose was when he was confronted by relative equals, as the concentration and effort required to effectively combat them turned what should have been his greatest asset into a massive liability, as he can't take the time to muster the concentration and energy without leaving himself totally exposed. Combatively speaking, Yoda's use of his powers made him analogous to Gregor Clegane, overwhelmingly powerful and capable of crushing almost any opponent, and in turn practically impossible to overpower, but lacking in precision, and where a direct offense against him is guaranteed to fail, skill-based attacks aimed at bypassing his defenses are proven effective against him. When dealing with Dooku's assault on Geonosis, Yoda was able to block his telekinetic attacks and deflect his lightning with some effort but little difficulty. But as soon as he was placed on the receiving end of Palpatine's telekinetic onslaught, he was forced to evade, as his own powers were too slow to deal with such a high volume of attacks. The only reason why he was able to fight back at all was because Palpatine's success went to his head and he let up his assault, giving Yoda time to retaliate. Yoda's main limitation as a combative Force wielder was his lack of creativity, wielding the Force like a blunt instrument and powering through his opponents rather than finding some way to undermine them. And this insistence on taking the most obvious path rather than the path of least resistance meant that he had nothing to fall back on when brute strength failed him. What made this limitation such a black mark against him was that it was completely self-imposed. As one of the top strategic minds and most powerful Jedi of his era, developing alternative offensive abilities, more refined Force throws for example, would have been a simple matter for him, but he failed to do this because he was ultimately a teacher and not a warrior, and was completely disinterested in combat. While I certainly don't hold this against Yoda on a personal level, it meant that he was held back as a fighter. Whenever able to overwhelm adversaries quickly and easily, Yoda won't hesitate to do so, but when that isn't an option, he only uses his powers when absolutely necessary, otherwise relying almost entirely on lightsaber combat. Out of the two combatants, there is no questioning Yoda's supremacy in terms of knowledge and power, but the gap between them isn't as wide as one would think. Darth Malak is a powerhouse, and quite an accomplished academic in his own right, and though Yoda's raw power definitely eclipsed his, he can still contend. In fact, I believe that an argument could be made that Malak is the superior combative Force wielder, employing a wider arsenal of offensive powers with a greater level of precision and tact than Yoda. However, this skill advantage doesn't do Malak any good, as his emphasis on direct attacks means that he wouldn't make any headway against Yoda. His telekinetic strikes would be tanked by Yoda's barriers, his lightsaber throws would be evaded, his lightning would be deflected by Tutaminis, Resisting Force stun would be a simple matter for a Force wielder of Yoda's caliber, and like Yoda, Malak has not perfected his skills at throwing loose objects. While Malak may use his powers to achieve tactical goals within a fight, and not just as a blunt instrument, he was ultimately held back by the same practical limitation as Yoda: the lack of alternative offensive powers. In Yoda, this was the result of disinterest. In Malak, this was the result of arrogance. The assumption that he would never encounter anyone powerful enough to defend against him, which I see as reflecting worse on him. More so, Yoda has clearly acknowledged his weakness and learned to work within its constraints, where Malak hasn't. If a pure Force duel were to ensue between these two, Yoda is the only one who would accomplish anything, as he would simply wait for an opening where Malak would vent everything on a fruitless blitzkrieg assault. However, such a contest is unlikely, as Malak is predominantly a swordsman who treats his Force abilities more as a supplementary skill, and Yoda would be unwilling to instigate such a confrontation against such an overtly powerful Darksider. But at the end of the day, Yoda's advantage is unquestionable, and all Malak would be able to do is cope. Grandmaster Yoda gets the edge as a Force wielder. A noted and formidable warrior, Darth Malak was a human male. Likely in his mid to late 30s, he was powerfully built and agile, boasting exceptional endurance. However, he also bore the scars of his experiences. Demigol's experiments on him left him with an elongated spine and a total lack of body hair. He was partially afflicted by the physical degeneration brought on by the dark side of the Force, which left him with deathly pale skin and clouded gray-colored eyes, and his jaw had been forcibly amputated after a failed lightsaber duel with Darth Revan, with Malak wearing a cybernetic collar to conceal the wound and allow him to speak, imparting his voice with a gravelly electronic tone. A consummate martial artist, Malak's physical capabilities were truly exceptional, likely the greatest demonstration of his endurance being his survival of Demigol's experiments. Strong and athletic, Malak met the demands of combat with a surprising amount of grace. Grandmaster Yoda claimed to be just as vital in his old age as he was in his youth, but I can't help but question this. His species was unknown, though they possessed an exceedingly long lifespan, as Yoda was 877 years of age by the end of the Clone Wars. However, Yoda was elderly, racked with arthritis, walking with a pronounced limp that necessitated the use of a cane to maintain basic mobility, and demonstrated labored breathing. His combative viability was due entirely to his use of Force-based physical augmentation. His enhanced agility was astounding, suggesting that he possessed superior agility in his youth. However, due to his age, his stamina was compromised, his short bout with Dooku leaving him visibly exhausted, and fatigue being one of the main causes of his defeat at Palpatine's hands. It must be remembered that Yoda died of old age within the time frame of the films, and to a centuries-old being, 30 years is a negligible span of time, meaning that the differences in his physical constitution between the Clone Wars and his time of death would be practically nil. While his use of the Force to enhance his agility made him an extremely formidable combative dervish, Yoda burnt out fast. Yoda's only advantage is that he is a small, fast-moving target, and otherwise Malak's superiority over him is unquestionable. Malak has youth on his side, his strength and stamina substantially outclasses Yoda's, and while I will concede that Yoda's Force-enhanced agility is likely superior to Malak's, it's not by an overwhelming degree and Malak can still contend with it. Darth Malak gets the physical edge. As a veteran of the Mandalorian Wars and an infamous Sith warlord, Darth Malak stood as one of the most skillful and experienced lightsaber masters of his day. He engaged the famed Jedi Battlemaster Kavar in combat, and though the rumors of Kavar's death were grossly exaggerated, Malak evidently still prevailed. In fact, word of God has it that he was Darth Revan's superior as a swordsman. While Malak's chosen martial arts discipline has not been established in any source, Evan Nova theorized that he was a specialist in the Makashi and Ataru forms, using them as the basis for a study of Juya, an idea that I agree with. Juya was the 7th form of lightsaber combat and most demanding of all, employing bold, direct moves driven by intense, focused emotion. As the technique was so advanced, only high-level masters of multiple fighting styles could even attempt to study it, which made it so that no two applications of Form 7 were ever alike, as all students of the art were going in with entirely different skill sets and backgrounds. The use of Makashi and Ataru as the foundation for this discipline is suggested by the technical aspects of Malak's style, his guard positions and maneuvers. Makashi was an ancient form developed specifically for blade-to-blade combat, employing linear cut-and-thrust swordplay based around precision and efficiency. Ataru was more contemporary, an extremely aggressive form based around elaborate, flourishing swordplay reinforced by dynamic force-assisted acrobatics and physical combat techniques. The primary example of a duelist who relied on a Makashi-Ataru hybrid was the Clone Wars-era Jedi Master Shaak Ti. Shaak Ti applied the linear and efficient blade work of Makashi to the dynamic maneuvers and acrobatics of Ataru, resulting in quite an energetic defensive fighting form centered around evasion. Malak evidently did the exact opposite, applying the elaborate and flourishing swordplay of Ataru to the more relaxed postures and footwork of Makashi, resulting in an energy-efficient offensive fighting form that de-emphasized physical combat in favor of pure swordsmanship. This already formidable technique was then further reinforced by his study and application of Juya, amping up his offensive output. The result was a trade-off. On the one hand, his customized style was both incredibly effective and easily sustained in the long term, turning him into a nigh unstoppable juggernaut of destruction, capable of breaking an opponent's guard and overwhelming them with only a few moves. But on the other hand, the reliance on purely offensive blade work left him at a disadvantage when forced into a defensive posture, and the de-emphasis on the physical aspect of Ataru left him extremely vulnerable against unarmed combat techniques. Furthermore, while absolutely devastating in single combat, his conduct indicated that he was likely weak against large groups of assailants. However, it should be noted that his lack of defensive viability was not an oversight, but a calculated risk. Assuming that he truly was a specialist in Forms 2, 4, and 7, then he would have been an exceedingly versatile duelist, as all three forms were noted for their elaborate and diversified techniques. This heavy-handed style was further reinforced by his cunning integration of force-based attacks and his tactical ingenuity. Darth Malak was not particularly well regarded as a strategist, criticized for his over-reliance on brute force, though I see this perception as being entirely due to negative comparisons to Darth Revan, who stood as one of the greatest strategic minds in galactic history. Taken on his own merits, Malak was cunning and skillful, proving his mettle as both a tactical planner and analyst. During the battle for the Starforge, he correctly deduced that none of his followers were capable of stopping Revan, but he was able to use them to both slow Revan down and force his allies to break off and run damage control, isolating the former Dark Lord and buying himself more time to prepare his chosen battlefield in advance of their confrontation. Though he ultimately overestimated the effect that the force-based technology of the Starforge would have on the contest, he demonstrated a keen understanding of both his enemies and his allies, and an ability to control engagements on a grand scale. His tactics on a more immediate level were best demonstrated in his confrontation with Revan, Bastila Shan, and Cartho Nasi on board the Leviathan. He was effectively dropped into this contest cold, having no prior knowledge of Revan's escape before his own arrival, and yet was able to come up with an effective plan of attack. He used Force Stun to disable Shan and Onasi, allowing him to focus his efforts on Revan, and after a brief bout, he retreated into the network of corridors around the Leviathan's docking bay, luring Revan after him and further isolating him. Had Revan's allies not been able to intervene when they did, Malak would have prevailed. Even then, Malak was still able to turn things back in his favor, isolating Shan while forcing Revan and Onasi to flee. Though Revan survived, Malak still accomplished one of his main strategic objectives in the war, the capture of Bastila Shan. Malak was an expert at controlling his battlefield, using it to hurt his opponents or provide himself with an advantage, the primary example being when he used the technology of the Starforge to amp his own powers during his final confrontation with Revan. He demonstrated a good understanding of his own strengths and limitations through his emphasis on isolating and overwhelming his adversaries, the occasional unsubstantiated verbal boast notwithstanding, and he knew to keep certain elements in reserve in case his initial response proved insufficient. He didn't actively draw upon the power of the Starforge until he had ascertained that his native abilities were insufficient. Though arrogant, he was wise enough to realize that a contest where he was forced to exhaust his bag of tricks was not an unlikely hypothetical, but an eventuality. This in mind, his application of his fighting style was likely based around cycling through radically different offensive sequences, adapting his technique to suit the opponent. It should be noted that while Malak has employed tactical retreats to regain his composure when driven onto his back foot, he has never actually fled from battle, his honor and his ego demanding that he stick it out like a man rather than run like a coward. That being said, he was perfectly willing to use treachery and sneak tactics to turn a fight around or ambush an opponent. In conclusion, Darth Malak was a dangerously unpredictable and cunning offensive dervish. Though his lack of defensive viability was a significant weakness, his tactical ingenuity and masterful use of the dark side was usually more than enough to compensate. Though the limitations in his method left him ill-suited for confrontations with duelists of equal or greater skill, he never ceased to be a serious threat, no matter who he was engaging. Grandmaster Yoda was regarded as the greatest lightsaber master of his era. He was a high-level master of all 7 lightsaber forms with the sole exception of Vapad, though his primary technique was Ataru, which served as the backbone for his offensive capabilities. Yoda's application of Ataru was based around the core elements of the form elevated to the nth degree. These elements, the Su-Ma rotations, represented the 3 axes of motion possible within a 3-dimensional space, and were the foundation for the acrobatics that Ataru was based around. Yoda heavily relied on these maneuvers to compensate for the limited reach and mobility brought on by his stature and his age. Intriguingly, Yoda largely dispensed with the elaborate flourishes of Form 4, instead basing his blade work around full-body spins and flips. Though he was noted for his dexterity, his stature made these elements unnecessary, as the acrobatics provided the same effect, confusing adversaries with dazzling blade work. Additionally, this refinement also improved his move-to-move transitions and reduced the technical demands, making his style easier to execute. Yoda's primary attribute was sheer, mind-numbing speed, allowing him to unleash an overwhelmingly high volume of attacks, more than enough for him to immediately flatten whatever he came up against 9 times out of 10. Additionally, he did not sacrifice his defensive viability as a swordsman, switching over to a clear master-level application of Surisu when necessary, an element helped along by the fact that he was a small, fast-moving target. Secondly, while he never employed integrated telekinetic strikes in battle against other Force adepts, he made quite effective use of this skill on the battlefield. There is no questioning that Grandmaster Yoda was the greatest academic master of lightsaber combat in his era, and an unparalleled instructor in the art. However, I feel that he had too many practical deficiencies to truly be ranked as the greatest lightsaber master, period. Naysayers will cite Yoda's perfect track record as a duelist, but they forget that he has only been featured taking part in 4 duels total, 2 in the films, 1 in the classic EU, and 1 in TCW, and all against the same 2 individuals. All that has been proven is that he is capable of overcoming Dooku and Palpatine in lightsaber combat, and while I will concede that his success against these 2 indicates that he is more than likely capable of overwhelming the vast majority of duelists, I see this as being the result of how their skills and attributes balance out, rather than a sign of Yoda's purported superiority. Taking an offensive stance of any sort against Yoda, whether Dooku's conservative push-and-pull method or Palpatine's unrestrained onslaught, was tantamount to suicide, as an attacker would be left extremely exposed against such a small, fast-moving target. As the vast majority of lightsaber duelists, Jedi or Sith, were all dedicated offensive heavyweights, this meant that they would have been extremely vulnerable against Yoda, as his small size and agility enabled him to simply evade their attacks, get inside their guard, and cut them down almost immediately. However, while Yoda was clearly highly effective when dealing with aggressors, I don't see him enjoying the same advantage against dedicated defensive fighters, simply because his whirlwind offensive is exactly what their styles are designed to answer. While his simplification of the Ataru technique ramped up his attack speed, it also meant that he traded away the erratic, unpredictable nature of the style, and when one examines his moveset, it becomes readily apparent that his attacks follow a very clear, repetitive pattern. As his every attack was a spinning sideswipe or a somersaulting overhand, he was incapable of undermining or bypassing an opponent's defenses. He can't engage your blade in a bind and twist it out of your hand or push it aside. All he can do is come crashing against your block with everything he has. To be clear, the minimum requirement for holding Yoda off for any period of time would be a Council Master level application of Surisu, and the number of duelists who could accomplish this could be tallied up with the fingers on one hand. Additionally, Yoda's conduct suggested that he was aware of this limitation and worked to circumvent it, using psychological manipulation to encourage opponents to underestimate him and goad them into meeting him head-to-head with offense, allowing him to dispatch them quickly without being drawn into a lengthy war of attrition. However, this seemed to be the only way in which Yoda applied his tactical insight to single combat, otherwise relying purely on martial might to flatten his opponent, failing to make tactical use of his environment or to control the fight in a broad sense, and critically, failing to prevent the opponent from doing the same against him. This stands in marked contrast to Yoda's conduct on the battlefield, where he was distinguished by his ingenuity and situational awareness, and reflected his inexperience as a duelist. Aside from his confrontations with the Sith during the Clone Wars, the only other lightsaber duelists that Yoda had engaged were the Bafasi Dark Jedi and possibly the Force Witches of Dathomir after the Jedi training vessel Chuanthor crashed there in 500 BBY. In conclusion, Yoda represented the best and worst aspects of the Jedi Order's approach to martial arts training during his era. At that time, the emphasis was on battlefield engagements, not duels, so they fell into an almost universal pattern of relying on stonewall defensive postures for blast deflection, followed up by whirlwind offensives to quickly dispatch enemies once they closed the distance. This approach was clearly successful, otherwise it wouldn't have become as widespread as it was, and it could be employed with any form or configuration of forms. But in relying on it so completely, the Jedi fell into the trap of specializing in a single skill rather than diversifying, leaving themselves with nothing to fall back on when they finally encountered that situation or opponent that their skills failed to address. And Yoda was no exception. Though a master of all 7 forms, the only offensive technique that he could apply practically as is was Ataru. And rather than adapting the other forms to suit his needs and broaden his skill set, he just invested everything into Ataru. Yoda was a paradox of overwhelming advantages and crippling weaknesses, an unstoppable force capable of sweeping aside all opposition 999 times out of 1,000, but against that one immovable object, he was utterly impotent. Purely as swordsmen, Darth Malak and Grandmaster Yoda were very similar, both being extremely agile speed fencers whose MO was to goad their opponents into attacking them first so they could exploit the resulting defensive lapses and dispatch them immediately. Overall, I see Malak as being the superior duelist, as he created a unique fighting style that effectively incorporated a variety of techniques and influences, whereas Yoda was a one-trick pony who put all of his eggs into the Ataru basket. However, Yoda has logistics on his side. Unlike Malak, he did not sacrifice his defensive viability as a swordsman and was much less exposed. This superior defensive coverage was bolstered by the fact that Yoda was a small, fast-moving target, which left him much better optimized to get inside the opponent's guard than Malak, which I see as being the decisive advantage that makes this Yoda's game. But it should be noted that this advantage doesn't mean that Malak would be defeated immediately, as he is still powerful enough to contend with Yoda. The only reason for Darth Malak's negative reputation is the fact that he is constantly being compared to Revan, who stood as one of the greatest strategic minds and most powerful Sith Lords in galactic history. The number of Force wielders of any denomination who could measure up to that is very small, and holding Malak to that standard does him a huge disservice. When taken on his own merits, Malak is actually extremely capable. He is a cunning strategist in his own right, one of the greatest swordmasters of his era, a powerfully direct combative force wielder, and his experiments with Rakatan technology mark him as an accomplished academic. For all intents and purposes, Malak was the Dooku of his era. Not top tier, but unquestionably one of the greats, and therefore fair competition for Yoda. As I think I've made quite clear, I see Malak as being the more skillful combatant overall, the problem being that he is skilled in all the wrong ways. His emphasis on direct offense in both lightsaber combat and force abilities being precisely the wrong approach to take, because overpowering an opponent as powerful as Yoda is simply impossible. The battle between Darth Malak and Grandmaster Yoda would play out primarily as a lightsaber duel, as lightsaber combat is Malak's first response, and Yoda would be unwilling to use the Force against such an overtly powerful Darksider. Malak's lack of defensive viability and overall logistical disadvantage would prevent him from dominating, but he would not be overwhelmed immediately and would be able to contend with Yoda quite effectively. However, his ultimate defeat would be practically assured, and though he would fall back on his force abilities to compensate, all he would accomplish would be to slow Yoda down. Where Dooku on Geonosis was able to create an opening to allow himself to disengage and retreat, Malak wouldn't be able to do even that. His arsenal of direct attacks lacking the flexibility to be applied in that way. Unable to control the engagement and incapable of breaking off, Malak would be forced to fight it out. And as he is using a purely offensive fighting technique against a small, fast-moving target that is optimized to evade his attacks and get inside his guard, he would be fighting an uphill battle with the odds stacked against him. And given his track record in such circumstances, he would likely fold under the pressure. Malak's superior physicality is a non-issue, as the fight would be a brief affair and not a war of attrition. For all intents and purposes, Darth Malak is precisely the sort of opponent that Yoda is optimized to combat, his entire skill set and approach playing into Yoda's hands on almost every level. Yoda is an unstoppable force that sweeps aside everything in his path, until he collides with an immovable object, at which point he burns out fast. Fortunately for him, Darth Malak is not an immovable object. I declare Jedi Grandmaster Yoda the victor.